Namaste and hello. My name is Kai. Welcome to my channel. This is for whoever wants to hear it. Most of the videos that I've been posting in the past few months has been for my grandkids primarily, but this is for you. I'm curious to see how well this would be received. I've spent, pardon the noise of the birds in the background, I happen to have, I'm camped in a place where there's like 50 peacocks, and it's mating season, so they're having a great time out there. I've lived a life on the road. I ran away from home early, and I've traveled all over the United States many, many times, and I've had quite a few adventures, positive and negative. And that's kind of what this channel is about, is sharing those adventures and the lessons that I've learned from them. And it's also to help my grandkids learn who their grandfather is. So anyway, I am presently writing a book. I've had many times people ask me to or suggest that I need to write a book about my life. And now I personally, there's nothing special about me. There's nothing, this personality is of no big deal. It's 100 years after I die, nobody will remember me, and that's perfectly fine with me. But if I can help somebody make it through the next day or make it over the next hump with a little more grace, that's worth my time, I think. So I decided to take people's advice and write a book. I'm going to read just a little bit of it, the start of it, and I'd like for you to mention down in the comments if this is something that you're interested in. Would you be willing to read this book? How's my writing? Is it, I'm not a highly educated man, at least not formally, and I couldn't tell you very much about the differences between adverbs and dangling participles or any of that jazz, but I've read a lot of books, so anyway, I just tried to make it interesting. So let me read a little bit about what I'm writing here. The tentative title is A Life on the Road. And so it begins. If you move, you breathe, you do anything, you're dead, declared my drunken father. I'm not moving, Dad, I softly exclaimed as I stood stock still, staring down the barrel of his .38 caliber stub-nose pistol, no more than 5 inches away from my forehead. I knew I was going to hurt soon, as he had his good set of false teeth in. He had 2 sets, and whenever he changed into his newer set, I got hurt. The hole looked huge to 9-year-old me. At least, I think I was 9, maybe 11. Remembering the timing of events, especially in my childhood years, has never been something that I was skilled at. I had shot that little gun several times in the past, so I knew how easy it was to fire, what with it having a hair trigger and all. I could see the end of the bullet about 2 or 3 inches inside the barrel. It had a hollow point, and if he chose to shoot, or drunkenly twitched, I knew there was no way I could live through it. Oddly, I don't remember feeling fear at that moment. There simply wasn't enough time. The fear came later. He stood there swaying slightly, a slight tremor evident by the unsteadiness of the barrel of the pistol. Time slowed way down, and details stood out. I could tell that my breathing became very shallow, my chest barely moving at all. I could see where he had filed the sight down so that he could pull it out of his clothing quickly if he wished. I could see the slight whitening of the knuckle of his trigger finger, finger wrapped around the trigger. I could even see the sweat from the heat of the South Florida late spring day. I was focused and alert, but oddly not really scared, although I knew my life might end violently at any moment. I suspect I was so focused on the moment that fear simply didn't have the opening to start up. I could see, excuse me, dang it. Sorry, I got lost here. My screen is too small. I could see his face over the top of the gun without moving my eyes from the bullet, and was aware that he had his "you are about to get hurt" face on. The immediate danger was signaled mostly by how he bit his lower lip. I remember that at the time, I just wished he'd pull the trigger. After a long moment, he quickly moved the gun sideways and then struck me with the barrel. It's right here, the scar. Right on the right corner of my mouth. I bear the scar to this day. Without choice, I dropped to the floor. I knew better than to cry at that moment. The tears could come later. I just laid there, holding my hands against the wound while he turned around to take another drink. Rum and coke was his poison on this particular day. I remember the smell. After a while, the remorse for his abuse set in, as precedent suggested it would. As he drank, the anger, or whatever it was he felt for himself, directed at me, would fade and he would begin to tear up. Maybe he was also scared he would get caught abusing his children. I could only conjecture. What happened most often after an abusive episode, he would cry and hug me close to him, and he would sit me on the couch and get his Bible, and he would read to me for a short while. Then he would close the book and get out his projector, with which he'd show me porn movies. Sometimes he would reverse the order of those two things. What that sequence of events eventually did was to trigger me to get sexually aroused when I was reading the Bible, and to get religious when doing something sexual. That's been a really odd combination to live with and overcome, to be sure. This isn't a book about all the bad stuff that happened to me, although I suspect there will be a number of those times included. It's a book of my journey through life so far, and of the drastic changes and incredible gifts that were wrapped in unpleasant and sometimes horrible paper, and how I learned to be free from it all. I simply don't want to pass from this life without leaving what I have learned behind for someone else to use, if they wish. A frequent phrase of mine is, "The universe has no idea how to wrap presents. It always wraps the best presents in the worst possible wrapping. To live a happy life, ignore the wrapping and focus on the present itself." Please understand that these are my memories, and sometimes, almost accidentally, they match my family's memories. Don't take them as fact, as memories are reliably unreliable. They are but phantom pictures of one view of a multitude of realities that were going on simultaneously. Chapter 1. People have been telling me for years that I should write a book of my life. It seems that many people find the story of my life interesting, but what's more, they learn from the tales of my experience. My history is just that, his story. It isn't who I am, nor does it make me who I am. My experience have helped or hindered my ability to navigate society, interact with others, and has colored my vision of reality with alternating shades of light and dark. Who I am is something much greater than any story can tell, and so are you. Seriously. Of this I am convinced beyond even the slightest doubt. I am hoping that reading of my journey will help you see yours in a different fashion, maybe in a way that is deeper and fuller than how you experience it now. I am not a trained writer, and in fact have had little formal schooling, so when I fail to honor some rule of writing, I ask that you just ignore the rule and continue on. What presents I have gained from the events already stated? Resilience, for one. I have known all my life that I will get back up when knocked down, physically and emotionally. I learned that sometimes stuff happens for reasons that really have nothing to do with me. All that stuff led me to go into therapy, which taught me that I did not cause the events, but rather it was my father's belief in his own mental phantoms that caused his behavior. Just as an aside, I had a stroke a number of years ago, and it did affect my speech a little bit. So sometimes I will stumble over words or something. That is a result of that stroke. Moving on. Taught me that I did not cause the events, but rather it was my father's belief in his own mental phantoms that caused his behavior. A happy person never wishes unhappiness on others, even when that person abuses them. Because of the therapy, I gained understanding that the inner world is as deep and even more fascinating than the outer world. It taught me to honor women, although I had to go through a period of not honoring women, and to realize that all spiritual teachings are what we ourselves make of it. It's not what others tell us it is. These were large presents to unwrap, and took me a long time to do it, but doing so showed me how it is done. Now, thanks largely to events like these in childhood and early training of people who are dangerous, and the self-generated isolation that belief triggered, I get a little excited when I recognize that the universe has given me a gift, because I know that the present is always worth the unwrapping. And I've become fairly efficient at unwrapping universal gifts. I've certainly had enough practice. My childhood, like many, was fraught with many joys and sorrows. It was often unpleasant to my memory, but I suspect that's mainly because I have held on tightly to the unpleasant stuff, not wanting to face it, but let the good stuff process right on through. I was born of a 21-year-old mother who was married to an abusive 26-year-old alcoholic. I had two older siblings, Victoria, Vicky. She died in 2020, 3 days after my birthday. Then aged 3, and John, aged 2. We were pretty poor, from what I understand from conversations with my mother, myself, of course, being too young to know the difference at the time. My first year was spent mostly in the hospital with whooping cough, followed by double pneumonia. Mom says I learned to pull myself up and walk around my crib before I got to spend much time at home. A gift, since my first year had little influence of my father's destructive habits. Mom says that the nurses all loved me because I would eat whatever they fed me and was a happy baby, and that they called me their little Ricky. My original name was Richard. When she came to visit me, a nurse was often rocking me next to my crib. For part of that year, I was in a hospital far from home, and there were long stretches of time when Mom simply couldn't get there to visit. I often wonder what effect that had on the direction of my life. We moved around the Hamilton-Cincinnati area a number of times before I eventually ran away from home for real. There were numerous occasions of being beat up by my father and brother in those early years, but I was protected in many ways from the full brunt of abuse thanks to my sister and mother. I suspect that my brother also protected me, but my memories say that he was also quite the bully, which makes sense, as turning him into a bully was an oft-stated objective of my father when John was born. My mother, when she found out that Tom had been intimately abusing my sister, got us away from him as quickly as she could. I bless that tiny woman daily for her courage, kindness, compassion, and strength. I really do. My mom's awesome. She told me that on the day that she kicked him out, she gathered up all of his alcohol and dumped it out, sent our kids to our grandparents next door, and then sat at the table with a loaded pistol waiting for him to come home. To this day, she swears that had he come home during that time, she would have shot him. Luckily for us all, he stopped to drink after work and gave her time to calm down and realize what would happen if she shot him. So she dismantled the pistol and hid the pieces. When he got home, he passed out in the bed. When he awoke the next morning, she made him coffee and then told him that she was going to divorce him and would be taking us with her. He had been having an affair with a babysitter, so he knew he was beat. When asked what she wanted out of the divorce, Mom said, "Everything I can get." And with that, the marriage ended. We moved to a little house a few miles away that was close to a swimming pool. I was perhaps 3 years old at this time. I remember lots and lots of water bugs, which are kind of like giant cockroaches. They'd come out at night and cover the floor. To get to the bathroom, we'd jump from the table to the couch to the chair. When we turned on the light, the bugs would scatter in a frenzy. However, a single woman with 3 children and no money from our father, well, occasionally our utilities would get turned off. Mom was heroic in keeping us fed and clean, despite the hardships. And I can't for the life of me figure out how women do it. Seriously, no clue. I've met a few men who were capable of such feats of selflessness and sacrifice, but it seems almost inherent in the smarter and stronger half of humanity. Yes, I'm referring to women. Okay, so I am going to jump forward a little bit, and I do want you to recognize that I did mention in here that things about my brother and my sister, and I did get permission to use them. So I'm going to jump to when I got on the road. Let's see if I can find that. Here we go. Chapter 2, The Road. Running away at such a young age wasn't the wisest course of action I could have taken, but at the time it seemed like my freedom was on the line. When I was grounded, I knew I couldn't escape the shenanigans of my bully of a brother. I want to remind the reader that that my father had intended to make my brother a bully. He has long since matured beyond such ridiculousness. I had no idea of where I'd run to when I left that day. My intention was just to get away, and not be found. As I remembered it, I figured the police would search all the obvious roads out of town, so I chose to go along a 2-lane country road to the freeway, which intersected the road about some 25 miles away in Indiana. I walked a large part of the way, afraid that the next car would be someone who was looking for me. That night was a Sunday or a Monday, I suspect, because I remember stealing a newspaper from someone's driveway and stuffing my clothes with crumpled paper. Thank you, Boy Scout training. Although I remember it being intensely cold, I made it through okay. I remember hiding from cars that first day out, jumping behind bushes and trees, occasionally having to hop in the dry, overgrown ditch that ran most of the way along the road. Somewhere during that walk, I decided I would head to Hollywood. The reason... Dang, where the heck did that go? Well, Sorry, I clicked on something and the book kind of went phew. Okay, the reason I chose that destination had much more to do with my ignorance than my knowledge. I didn't know much about it, but many movies were made about people running off to Hollywood and becoming a star, so I figured that at least no one would look for me there. My ignorance of geography and society became evident in that choice years later. I shoplifted as much as I could get away with, saving the silver dollars I had stolen from my mother for when I had no other choice but to pay. I had shoplifted before at the urging of my brother and peers, so I had some experience with it. Thanks to my mother and grandmother's influence, I always felt guilty when I stole anything. I'm grateful for that. That trip is almost a complete blur to my memory once I caught my first ride, with two exceptions. Somewhere along the route, I was caught shoplifting food. Instead of having the authorities called, the owners of the little store gave me a large paper bag and told me to fill it, and then they just let me walk out with it. That was the first gift of generosity from a stranger that impacted my teenage awareness, and it made quite the lasting impression, as evidenced by its inclusion into this book. Over the years, I have purposefully paid that gift forward to others with that couple in mind. The other memory was sleeping in what I came to call bum beds, or the flat shelf directly underneath or under the first few feet of freeway overpasses at the top of the concrete slopes. These areas were about 4 or 5 feet high and about 5 feet wide usually. Back then they weren't fenced off or in some other ways made uninhabitable by authorities. They kept me safe and dry many, many times. Sometimes I'd have to share the flat space with someone else, but that was quite rare. Looking back, I now know that some higher power was watching over me during those early years on the road. I caught many rides from quite sketchy people through the years. Some of them I barely escaped with my life and body intact. I don't remember if this next part happened during the first trip to Hollywood, but it was close enough that I will include it here. I had gotten a ride somewhere near Las Vegas, Nevada on the way to California with a guy named William Bonin, a.k.a. the Freeway Killer. Yeah. Of course, I knew nothing about who he was at the time, but he was certainly the first real immediate threat to my life other than my father that I'm aware of. I didn't know of the killings that had been going on in Southern California then, but as soon as I got in the car, I had a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach, sensing without knowing why. It got worse as the ride continued. Soon after I got in the car, he started talking weird and coming on to me. He'd occasionally reach over and put his hand on my knee. I had absolutely no idea how to handle it. I kept scooting as closely as I could to the door, eventually faking falling asleep. In an odd way, I think doing that is what saved my life. He, apparently thinking I was really asleep, pulled off on an exit ramp. I can only surmise that he was taking me somewhere private to rape and kill me, as he was later convicted of having done with another of other young male hitchhikers. As he slowed at the bottom of the ramp, I quickly opened the door and flung myself out, leaving what little I had accumulated behind in his car, and took off across the desert, but aiming towards passing cars on the freeway. I think it was mostly beginner's luck, or grace, that I chose to head that way instead of heading out further into the surrounding desert. By running towards witnesses, I suspect that he was reluctant to give chase. It wasn't until I got to Hollywood and told a few people there of my ordeal that I found out just how much danger I had been in. I figured out later that had he succeeded, I would have been number 19 of his victims. I never told anybody back then because I was always afraid that I would get in trouble. I don't remember much about, I'm going to stop here shortly, so I don't remember much about those first few days in the city other than finding an old blanket somewhere and sleeping under some bushes. I did eventually find my way into the hills of Hollywood, an old abandoned estate actor Errol Flynn used to stay at, which became a well-known campground for the homeless and the drifters. It was during these first few days, though, that I first saw buskers, aka street performers. There was a guy who used to stand in front of Mann's Chinese Theater as a live statue, dressed like a cowboy. His name was Curtis Reed, and unknown to him, meeting him was one of the most significant events of my life to this day. Until I saw him, I stayed alive mostly by stealing and walking checks in restaurants. Watching him make money simply by standing still and occasionally moving quickly towards random people inspired me to try the same thing just a little further down Hollywood Boulevard and sometimes on the boardwalk of Venice Beach. I was a fairly good-looking young man then, although I truly didn't realize that at the time, having been taught that I was worthless and ugly by the males in my early life. I think it was the fresh-faced, attractive innocence that allowed me to actually make money street performing back then. However, it did eventually pay enough for me to outfit myself with a sleeping bag, backpack, clothes, and a few other incidentals. Okay, so that's just a little bit. And I'll give you a couple of highlights of my life as I continued. I've been picked up by 4 people who intended to kill me, from which I was lucky enough, obviously, to escape each time. I have been robbed down to absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back 7 times, 6 of those times during periods when I had no backup whatsoever. I had no money, I knew nobody, I just had to build myself back up from nothing. I'm a fire eater, juggler, or the skills that I've accumulated. I eat fire, juggle, do magic, mime. I teach ballroom and social dancing. I just do a huge number of entertaining things. I was a clown and a fool and a jester and a live mannequin, human robot. And so I've been all over the U.S. and pretty much every city and every state in the country. Not quite, but pretty much. I can't remember most of them. I have absolutely no fear about starting out from one side of the country with absolutely no money and heading for the other side of the country. As long as I got some balloons in my pocket, I'm going to be fine. I know this. I've taught a dance lesson on top of the Empire State Building. I taught a dance lesson on top of the World Trade Center back when it was standing. There was an observation deck up there. I've taught BDSM in San Francisco. If you don't know what that is, look it up. Or don't. I've just had a very adventuresome time as I'm writing this, but I don't typically go back over my memories unless I'm telling somebody about them, but when I'm alone, I don't bother thinking about them. This moment always is just too interesting for me to bother going back over the past. And but life has been truly amazing. So, if this is something that you're interested in, if you might want to read more about it, if you're interested in the book, if you have suggestions towards editing or want to help out in any way, pre-order the book, anything like that, please drop a comment below. I'd like to hear from you. I engage with those who comment, so Please. And if you want to, like, subscribe, share, as the saying goes. And I'll see you on the next video. Namaste.